Hey guys, in this month's Historical Fiction 101, I'm going to be giving book recommendations for ancient Greece. So the last book recommendations, I did biblical fiction, things related to the Old and New Testament. So this month, the topic is ancient Greece, and I love ancient Greece, you guys, and it's kind of unfortunate that I've not read too many books set in ancient Greece. So what do I mean by ancient Greece? I was doing some very rapid research, so if I'm mistaken about some dates here, kindly tell me if I'm wrong or not. But yeah, my research, apparently ancient Greece ran from about the 8th century BC to 600 AD. So yeah, that's a pretty long line of ancient Greek history there to run through. And yeah, I don't even have all of ancient Greece covered in the recommendations that I have. I kind of just have a very small portion of books to recommend. One of the leading authors when it comes to ancient Greek historical fiction is Steven Pressfield. It seems like he has tons of books related to ancient Greek history. It seems to be kind of his specialty. And I've only read one book from Steven Pressfield, and that is Gates of Fire. And this is about the Persian War, basically the Spartans versus the Persian army, you know, basically like 300, the movie. But yeah, this is like the more realistic historical adaptation of that battle. This is actually one of my dad's books, and he recommended I read this, and I'm glad he gave this to me to read because I ended up really enjoying this, even though this is military historical fiction. And I'm not really into military historical fiction because I'm not really someone who enjoys reading battle sequences. They kind of bore me and I get a little confused. But the stuff that had nothing to do with the battle sequences, that was all the stuff that I in particular really enjoyed about this book. I loved the characters. The characters were the best thing about this book. So yeah, if you liked 300 and you kind of want more of a historical, more accurate take, I'm guessing, then yeah, I definitely recommend this. And then my dad also had another Steven Pressfield book, the Afghan Campaign. I guess Alexander the Great, when he was going through what was then Afghanistan, I'm assuming. And yeah, anything with Alexander the Great, I think, can be classified in this topic for ancient Greece historical fiction, since he was king of a little nation in Greece, I guess is what it was. I'm not entirely familiar on Alexander the Great, you guys. You would think I would be, but I'm not. And then there's also this other book called The Virtues of War, which is also about Alexander the Great. And then the last book that I'd like to recommend from Steven Pressfield is this book called The Last of the Amazons. And I guess this is about the Amazons, the badass female warriors. This sounds pretty exciting. I think whenever I see this, I'm going to try and purchase it. So yeah, like I said, Steven Pressfield, he seems to really like a lot of ancient Greece. So I recommend kind of going through his bibliography and seeing if there's anything else you guys would be interested in from him. So then let's move on over to the Trojan War, which is probably the most popular and iconic when it comes to ancient Greece. Most everyone, I think, knows about the Trojan War. You know, Hector, Achilles, Paris, Helen, gods sometimes. Sometimes the Greek gods like to infiltrate their way into these stories. And the Trojan horse. We all love that Trojan horse, you guys. So the first book that I have here in my list of recommendations for the Trojan War is Marion Zimmer Bradley's The Firebrand. And this is about Cassandra, who was a priestess, and she was the daughter of King Priam of Troy, the sister of Hector, and the twin sister of Paris. It's funny, I've read Marion Zimmer Bradley's The Mists of Avalon quite recently, and I was pretty thrilled when I came across The Firebrand. Definitely sounds like something I'd enjoy, so I think next time I head out looking for some books, I'll try and find this book as well. Next, we have The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller, and this is about Achilles and his relationship with Patroclus. from my understanding with this book, it's presenting Achilles and Patroclus as lovers, basically, which I don't think is entirely a new concept. That's kind of always been a theory when it comes to analyzing the Trojan War. I even wrote like a 10-15 page paper for one of my literary classes when we read the Iliad. I even wrote a paper on the relationship between Patroclus and Achilles. So yeah, it's nothing new, and but still different though. A lot of times people really like to macho up Achilles and kind of skip over this whole thing with Patroclus. So I'm very interested to read this and to read this relationship. Sounds pretty thrilling. Next I have Helen of Troy by Margaret George, which is about Helen of Sparta, who becomes Helen of Troy, and she ends up marrying Prince Paris. And yeah, she's basically kind of the starting point, or the excuse anyway, for why the Trojan War starts. And yeah, I love this book. It's pretty hefty. It goes through pretty much all 10 years of the Trojan War, so yeah, that's a reason why it's a hefty book, but still very good. Next, I have the Penelope Ad by Margaret Atwood, and this is kind of a retelling of the Odyssey, and it's focused on Penelope, who is Odysseus's wife. And I've certainly never read a book focused on Penelope. Most books tend to focus on Odysseus. So yeah, that sounds pretty cool, focusing on Penelope and kind of her side of the story and what she's going through. So yeah, a very feminist book, I think, is what it's intended to be. And then next, we've spent a lot of time kind of talking about like the Iliad and the Odyssey, and so I'm going to include the Iliad and the Odyssey in this list of recommendations. Like I said, I did some quick research for the Iliad and the Odyssey, and my understanding is that Homer, the author of these two books, Homer wrote about the Iliad and the Odyssey over 100 years after the events of those two events, if they were real events. And yeah, by definition, that is the definition of historical fiction. Historical fiction has to take place at least 50 years after a event. And yeah, if the researchers and the people who study the Trojan War, if they're all correct in assuming that Homer wrote these two books at least a good 100 years after the events of the Trojan War, then yeah, I think the Iliad and the Odyssey could definitely be considered historical fiction. So yeah, for the purposes of this video, I'm going to go ahead and recommend this as historical fiction. Next, I have Dark of the Moon by Tracy Barrett, and this is young adult fiction focused on Ariadne, who is kind of part of Greek mythology. And Ariadne had a lot to do with, the labyrinth and the Minotaur and whatnot. So this sounds pretty cool, and the cover is really pretty too. You can see the shadow of the Minotaur. And I'm a big fan of the BBC series Atlantis, and I love Ariadne in that series. The interpretation of Ariadne in this book is quite different, it sounds like. But yeah, I love everything involving Ariadne and the Minotaur and whatnot, so yeah, I'm going to recommend this as well. Next, I have 300 by Frank Miller. 300 I was talking about earlier with Stephen Pressfield. 300, it's a graphic novel. It was turned into a couple different movies. It's about the Persian War following Leonidas and whatnot. So yeah. If you like the movie, you'll probably really enjoy this graphic novel. Next, I have The Last of the Wine by Mary Reynal, I think is how her name is pronounced. And this book, it follows two Athenians, and they participate in the Olympic Games. And I think the synopsis said something about them participating in the Persian Wars, I want to say. I might have that mistake. It might be some other war. And they also become students of Socrates, I think the synopsis said. So yeah, this sounds pretty cool, and apparently Mary Reynal is kind of one of the leading historical fiction writers, and unfortunately I've never read anything from her, so this sounds pretty cool. And the last book I have is The 10,000 by Michael Curtis Ford, and this takes place in 401 BC, and apparently it covers like 3 decades of war in ancient Greece, and yeah, it features a lot of battles and whatnot. So yeah, another military historical fiction if you're into that kind of thing. So that's it for my book recommendations for ancient Greece. Like I said, I didn't even begin to cover every aspect of ancient Greece. It has has a long history, and there's a wealth of other books out there. And I didn't even cover the books that kind of deal with Greek mythology. There's a lot out there for that too, things like with Hercules and Medea and Medusa and stuff like that. So yeah, if you want to get more into that aspect, yeah, I think there's plenty of material out there for you guys. So did you guys find this list of recommendations helpful? Do you have any additional recommendations that I should go check out? So that's it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you liked this Historical Fiction 101, you may like these other videos. Bye guys.